Bf-109, Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane are three of the most iconic aircraft to serve in the Second World War. These high-performance fighters would be severely tested in the skies over the United Kingdom. Closely matched in performance, victory or defeat would come down to skill, tactics and luck.
When you look at the Battle of Britain, there are two aeroplanes that stand out, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. There were actually other airplanes, but really we concentrate on the Spitfire and Hurricane. Those are the evocative, iconic airplanes. I mean, I might argue that the Spitfire is the most iconic aeroplane ever. It didn't win the Battle of Britain, but we would have lost without it. Having said that, the older, slightly slower, but more maneuverable at altitude Hurricane, or the different gun configuration, with having the four machine guns on each wing grouped together to give it much harder firepower. That aircraft, first of all, there are more of them. There are about 39 squadrons at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. The Hawker Hurricane shoots down more than 53% of the German bombers and fighters which are attacking the United Kingdom. So without the Hurricane, there would have been no Battle of Britain. Is it the winner? Well, I've heard aces from the Battle of Britain, sadly no longer with us, but they would say, well, the Hurricane was like having a dependable hunter. When you were out riding, you would be on a hunter could go for any fence, any ditch, it would go over it. Whereas the Spitfire, if you're going to stay with the horse analogy, that's the thoroughbred. That's the horse that goes fast. And that's the difference in the two aircraft types. So Spitfires tended to climb faster, so they would intercept the Bf-109s and the Bf-110s. It doesn't mean to say that there was a plan, it was just the way it happened. And then the Hurricanes would take on the bombers more. Now the Hurricane has got this much better firepower of having the four guns grouped together, the 303 rifle caliber machine guns. And so actually it worked really well. So Spitfire, fighters, Hurricane bombers. Having said that, when there were combats between Hurricanes and Bf-109s or 110s, it's really interesting to see how successful the Hurricane was in combat because of its ability to turn. Whereas perhaps if you were flying a Spitfire with rifle caliber machine guns, then you were going to be having to spend some time, maybe 4 or 5 bursts. Then remember that you only have 14.7 seconds of machine gun ammunition in a Spitfire. It doesn't give you very long.
Spitfires and Hurricanes were the backbone of fighter command in the Battle of Britain, and each had their own strengths and weaknesses. So the Hurricane, for instance, which is often sort of malaligned as the less glamorous brother of the Spitfire, it's often considered the workhorse of the Battle of Britain. It flew in greater numbers, it shot down German aircraft in greater numbers, and ultimately it was a dependable aircraft. It had a very solid gun platform. It was easier to repair because, of course, Spitfires had a very specialist construction with their elliptical wings, so they were not quite so easy to repair and throw back up. But of course, Hurricanes did lag behind Bf-109s. Hurricanes flew at about 325 miles per hour, the Bf-109E at around 350 miles per hour at their top speeds. So as you can see, that difference in pace was quite a danger for the Hurricane. But the Spitfire, on the other hand, had that slight speed edge on the Bf-109. It was more aerodynamic, it was more nimble, it flew over 20 miles per hour faster, and of course it made incredibly tight turns. So the Spitfire really worried the Germans. It was seen as being the ultimate aircraft to be shot down by. And indeed, this led to this idea of Spitfire snobbery amongst the Bf-109 and Bf-110 crews. This was the idea that they had always been shot down by a Spitfire and never by a Hurricane, because they'd end up losing face if they were ever to admit that. And of course, Peter Townsend, who was a Hurricane pilot, had a particularly amusing tale to tell of this. He had shot down a German pilot. The German pilot had wanted to meet this great Spitfire pilot that had shot him down. And when he was presented with Peter Townsend, the Hurricane pilot, the German pilot ended up saying, "Can you do me a favor?" to Peter Townsend. And Townsend said, "Yes, of course, what is it?" And the German pilot said, "If anyone asks, can you please say that I was shot down by a Spitfire?" Here you can see this legend of the Spitfire and the fact that not only is it really celebrated as the thoroughbred of fighter command, but it's also really much admired and revered by the Luftwaffe as a true opponent, and sometimes an even better opponent than the Bf-109. It was generally accepted that both Spitfires and Hurricanes could outturn Bf-109s, but Lieutenant Erwin Leerkauf actually maintained that the Bf-109 had a tighter turning radius than the Spitfire, because he said that it was really common for the Bf-109 to go into a really tight turn and for its leading edge slats to basically bang. And when that happened, it felt as if the aircraft had been shot at. So he argues that. But ultimately, there were so many Luftwaffe fighter aces that complained about the sharp turns of the Spitfires. And Heinz Kanucker, for instance, said that the Spitfires make these absolute infernal turns and we cannot nail down the bastards. So they got so angry at trying to keep up with a Spitfire in a turn.
Small differences in performance could have a big effect on dogfights. Whether it was the turning radius, diving speeds, or stability, each fighter had unique and important characteristics.
Scramble is a turn-based game, so players are only flying airplanes for 2 seconds at a time. But the novel aspect of Scramble being a turn-based game is that we have a flight simulation underneath. So while planes fly for 2 seconds at a time, players actually pilot airplanes with controls that are really similar to the control setups that you would have in a real-time flight game. We want Spitfires to feel fast and to feel like they can outturn anything else in the sky. And we want Hurricanes to feel like they are stable and like they are a great gun platform for making long passes at bombers. And we want a 109 to feel like it can dive quickly and to feel like it has a better roll rate than anything else that it's fighting against.
Experience gained in the interwar period was crucial for developing an air force. Germany's intervention in the Spanish Civil War gave the Luftwaffe a critical edge in weapons and tactics.
The advantage the Germans had is that they had been, since 1936, experimenting with both fighter tactics and fighter ammunition and gun systems, armaments, because they'd been fighting in Spain with the Condor Legion, which had allowed them to work up the Bf-109 into a very competent fighter aircraft. They had also developed the cannon with its high explosive incendiary round, which meant that you only needed 1 or 2 of these rounds to cause a fire in a Spitfire, or particularly into a Hurricane, because their petrol tanks were not, initially were not armoured. Eventually they became self-sealing, so if they had a leak, suppress the fire. But the Germans had the advantage. As they went through the Battle of Britain, they modified their aircraft to suit the environment they were in. And so they had the cannon and machine gun armaments changed from Bf-109, different aircraft in the E series, all the way through. So what the Germans wanted to do was forward base their fighters, particularly single-engine Bf-109s, as close as possible to the Channel coast. Because once they got to the vicinity of London, they had about 6 or 10 minutes of fuel before a little red light would appear that said, "Time to go home." It's called the bingo light. It just goes bing, and they knew they had to turn to go back to France.
The Bf-109 and the Bf-110 were the backbone of the Luftwaffe's Jagdflieger, or fighter pilots, in the Battle of Britain. So the Bf-109 had been in service since before the war. It had first seen its action in the Spanish Civil War, and it really packed a mean punch. So the Bf-109 E3, for instance, had 2 cannons in its wings and 2 machine guns in its nose. And of course, the Luftwaffe was prided on having a better gunnery training program than the British. So The benefit of having cannon fire is that even though you've got less rounds, because it has explosive shells, it does cause more damage. And as a result, the Bf-109 was very much a formidable opponent in the Battle of Britain. The Bf-110 Zerstörer, the destroyer, on the other hand, had a bit less success in the Battle of Britain. So it was a twin-engine fighter. It did pack a formidable punch, but it wasn't quite as maneuverable as the other aircraft. It was not able to turn as tightly, even as a Bf-109. Of course, the fighter escorts of the Luftwaffe had to struggle with two tasks. Yes, they were protecting themselves, but they were also trying to protect the bombers they were escorting. They could go for what was known as a freie Jagd, or a free hunt, and ultimately they would go out ahead of the bombers and try to clear the area. But of course they had the issue sometimes that the Luftwaffe High Command wanted them very tightly towards the bombers, and this very much frustrated the fighter pilots because the German bombers were far slower in speed. So ultimately it's kind of like holding a horse, a racehorse, still in the stalls and it can't get out, and it's incredibly stressful for the fighter pilots. The Heinkel and the Dornier bombers had already had a lot of experience in the Spanish Civil War, in Poland, in France, and as a result, they were rugged, dependable aircraft, but they were quite slow. This did change with the Junkers 88 Schnell bomber, the fast bomber, but this was described by one of its pilots as being a bit of a diva. It wasn't an aircraft that you could easily convert to. And as a result, this bomber could have really made more of an impact in the Battle of Britain, but because it was so slow to convert over to it, it ended up not being deployed in as greater numbers. Perhaps the most infamous aircraft to appear in the Battle of Britain was the Junkers 87 Stuka. Now, the Stuka was a dive bomber that had been used to terrifying effect in Poland, in France, in all of its famous Blitzkrieg or Lightning War campaigns. But in the Battle of Britain, it's starting to prove really vulnerable. So Spitfires and Hurricanes outpace it tremendously, and it's incredibly vulnerable when it's coming down from its deadly dive. So when it's going over to the side and it's staying level and pulling back up, that actually ends up being the most dangerous moment to shoot down a Stuka. So they really start to struggle in the Battle of Britain. They are ultimately withdrawn about halfway through the battle because at the end of the day, they are proving far too costly towards Spitfires and Hurricanes to be of any use.
Speed and firepower are matters of life or death in aerial combat. In Scramble, the performance of aircraft is modelled on real-life historical data. Engines, ammunition and aerodynamics are all crucial factors in each battle.
Every aircraft that we model in Scramble is simulated with a unique performance envelope. We also have the ability to include characteristics of the machinery that were representative of those aircraft. For instance, the Bf-110 had big, powerful guns in the nose, and it does in Scramble as well. And the Bf-110 also had twin engines, so where a Spitfire can only take damage to one engine before a pilot has to bail out. A Bf-110 might be able to limp all the way back across the channel and make it home safely if it loses one full engine because it has a second one in reserve.
Technological advancements had paved the way for a revolution in air power. Better engines, special ammunition, and new fuel vastly improved performance.
The amazing thing about war is it spurs on technology. People who would take 3 years to develop something suddenly have to do it in 3 weeks. And this is exactly what was happening in the United Kingdom. We knew about, for example, high-octane fuel. So aircraft were flying with 87-octane fuel in the 1930s. That's fine, but it doesn't, at altitude, it's difficult to combust and get all the energy out of the fuel. There was a lot of work that was done by Rolls-Royce, for example, in turbochargers to put more air, force that into the engine so it would burn the fuel better. A brilliant British scientist came along and said, do you know what? We can change the octane of the fuel. We can make it 100 octane, which is going to burn so much better at altitude. It's going to give you about 300 feet a minute better rate of climb. It's going to give you something like 50 miles an hour better speed. So why don't we do that? The Americans, who had some very good petrochemical technology, started to do some work at Port Sunlight in Britain, and a lot of the work was done in Rotterdam. So in May 1940, when the Germans invade, two of the most significant ships to leave Rotterdam are oil tankers full of high-octane fuel. They came into Shellhaven, just down the road from London on the River Thames, and were able to unload the fuel. So by the time the Battle of Britain came about, squadrons here were having a much better rate of climb because they had 100-octane fuel.
And another important British innovation was making sure that they were using incendiary bullets. So it's often claimed that these were particularly effective, but it wasn't really the bullet itself that was the important thing. It was the fact that it gave off little flashes as it hit into the other aircraft. This made sure that the Hurricane pilot or Spitfire pilot could see exactly where his aim was. And so this was really crucial when you're trying to rake an aircraft and hitting all of its weak parts, whether it's engines, whether it's certain parts of the fuselage. So as a result, incendiary bullets were really important for the British in the Battle of Britain.
The Battle of Britain is won not just by pilots, not just by fighter aircraft, it's won by the whole nation. The whole nation comes together. Even the people who bake bread were all part of this thing to keep everybody working and happy and defending the nation.